Welcome to this presentation on the North Carolina Early Numeracy Skill Indicators and Associated Computation Probes. Over the course of this short presentation, we are going to be describing the background and research associated with these tools. And what we hope that you all will be able to have a clear understanding of at the end of this is what do we mean by the term early numeracy? And the second is, why is this an important thing for us to be thinking about in terms of measurement within our school or our district? So I want to start with this article that I saw in the New York Times Magazine back in 2014. And when you see the title of this article, particularly those of us who are in the field of education, it may be a little startling and perhaps even a little offensive. But you can see that the title is, "Why Do Americans Stink at Math?" So, of course, when I saw this title, I was compelled to peruse the article a little bit more. And the author really started to put together some evidence to support the statement. And one of the pieces of evidence that she shared was back in the 1980s. Some of you may be familiar with the hamburger restaurant known as A&W. They're the same ones that make the root beer. So in the 1980s, the marketing folks at A&W came together, and they determined that they wanted to target McDonald's, who had the largest portion of the market share. And the way that they wanted to do so was they wanted to target one of McDonald's best sellers, which was the Quarter Pounder with cheese. Okay, so they determined, the marketing folks there, was that our strategy for this, the way that we are going to come after McDonald's, is we're gonna make a bigger burger, but we're gonna sell it at the same price point. Okay, so what they determined was they were going to make their own 1/3 pound burger, and they were going to market it directly against the Quarter Pound burger at McDonald's. And so they did just that. In fact, they actually put forth a pretty heavy marketing campaign, sharing that we have this 1/3 pound burger, and it's priced less than or at the same cost point as the Quarter Pounder at McDonald's. So a few months in to their marketing campaign, and what they find are the sales are just absolutely abysmal. So they're just not being able to sell this burger. So they do what a lot of folks in marketing do, is they held some focus groups. As they brought these folks together, is that they realized they didn't have a hamburger problem, that they had a math problem. So as they started to ask folks, what's going on? We have this 1/3 pound burger, and McDonald's has this 1/4 pound burger. Well, what they heard was, well, why would I buy a 1/3 pound burger when I can get a 1/4 pound burger at McDonald's for roughly the same price? So you see, this is a common, it's a basic understanding of fractions, but it's a common error that we see with fractions, is that we start to view fractions as we do whole numbers, and we see that when we think about the number 1/4, the 4 is bigger, so the magnitude of this fraction must be larger. So that is a true story. That happened in the United States of America in the 1980s. And so after hearing that story, it put the title in a little bit more context. But then it also made me think about culturally what is happening with mathematics in this country. And I think there's a strong argument to be had that when we think about mathematics culturally, that there's something different in the United States, how we think about math compared to how we think about how math is thought about in other countries. And so we're gonna talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. But I want to make the case here that this truly is a problem and truly is an issue that we as educators need to be deeply, deeply concerned with. So one thing that we know is that the economy is now a global economy, that our kids are no longer competing with the kids across the street or the kids in the town adjacent to ours, or even with kids within our own state. We know that we now have an international economy, and so I would ask you, with that in mind, and thinking about the jobs that are currently available. One of the things that I always like to do is read the U.S. News and World Report. Annually, they do a ranking of the best jobs, and then they do that as the 100 best jobs. And so I'm always interested as to what percent of those jobs require some sort of science, technology, engineering, or mathematics knowledge. And I'll pause for a second as you reflect on that. What percentage of the top 50 jobs do you think require, and when I say that, have a really clear connection to some sort of STEM knowledge? So as we go out and hear trainings, it's not surprising. People think and know that it's a very high percentage. So we hear 80, 90%. And this year, it was actually, there was a clear connection with 100% of the jobs. 100% of the jobs, and as they rank these jobs, these are jobs that have the highest potential for income, the highest potential for income growth over time. And they're the jobs that people are the happiest in, that feel the most fulfilled with their lives. So these are all the things that we want for the kids that are in our classroom on a daily basis. And so we know that these students, that our students, are entering a global economy where math skills are highly, highly sought after and prized by employers. So when we think about numeracy and the importance of numeracy, and the data are clear, even for highly skilled readers, when you look at the other confounding factors, those who do not have the math skills, they do not end up with the same income and with the same types of jobs as other students with stronger mathematical backgrounds. So it's a critical issue for our kids, and it's a critical issue in ensuring that these students have the opportunity that we want for them to have as they leave our classroom doors. And so that brings us to the PISA studies. And some of you may be familiar with the Program for International Student Assessment, known as the PISA studies. So what we often hear from these studies, and what tends to be the most publicized and the most jumped upon by those who are banging the door of educational reform and politicians, is a really quick jump on how the rankings come out between countries. So we see countries like Finland who quickly jump into the international spotlight that we may not have thought a lot previously, because we find some scores that they tend to score high in the PISA studies. And to give you some background on the PISA studies, the PISA assessments are done when students are 15 years old. And that's because that is the height of compulsory education in several of the OECD countries. And it's really measuring a construct known as mathematical literacy. So this is not your run-of-the-mill kind of multiple choice test where you're answering questions that cover a single domain of mathematics and perhaps a somewhat unrealistic or decontextualized kind of situation. The problems really require students to think flexibly across mathematical domains, make connections between what they know about the number system and algebra and geometry, and answer questions that are real-world applications. And the types of problems that they would have to solve when they enter into the workplace. So what we see is that consistently over time, the United States has tended to has scored below the OECD average. So we know that when we look at the international comparisons, when we look at the comparisons, we're below the average score. But that is really not, that's the story that's publicized and politicized, but that is really not the true, the real story that underlies the PISA results. What I would argue is the really important information is that there's actually more variation within countries. So within the United States, there's a larger amount of variation between our low achieving students and our high achieving students than there is variation between countries. So if you've heard about the PISA studies or other international comparative studies, I wonder if you've heard that story, and that is the one that we want to talk about moving forward, because that is the story that has a lot of implications for how we think about and what we do with our assessment data, ensuring that we're using our assessment data in a responsible way, in a way that we know is going to support the progress of all kids in our schools. And so that brings us to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is also known as the Nation's Report Card. And what's interesting about these data, this is another metric in which we are able to look at the performance across different demographics of students within our country. From 1990 until up to this most recent 2014 assessment, the scale of the measure has been one that can be compared across each administration. And what that does is it allows for some useful comparisons longitudinally over time. And so, of course, one of the things that comes to mind of being interesting is how is the performance across these different demographics, how has it changed over time? So you can see this particular slide shows the difference between scores at 4th, 8th, and 12th grade in mathematics between white and black students, white and Hispanic students, male and female students, and students who are not eligible for free and reduced lunch and those that are. So there are significant gaps that have been found in the achievement or how students have performed on the NAEP assessments. And you can see that there's only been narrowing in these gaps for 4th grade students between 1990 and 2014 between white and black students. And when you look at what's referred to as the effect size, so what does this mean in real world kind of terms, day to day, how does this impact kids? Well, the NAEP sample is really quite large. So you can see really small changes or small narrowing that would result in a change that would be considered statistically significant. But when you look at more of the clinical significance of this, you see that it's really quite small. And day-to-day impact on kids, the difference is negligible. So I just want you to think about that for a moment and think about from the policy standpoint and from the funding standpoint and from the work that's done on a day-to-day basis for kids, how could this be the case, right? So we had No Child Left Behind, federal legislation that its primary intent was to narrow the gaps between different demographics of students. You think about Title I and just the great amount of money that has been used to support students who come from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. And just the intent of both of these, that it was quite noble, but it's had very little impact when we look at it. And so, how could that be, right? I hope that you're questioning, how could this be the case that we've fought to narrow these for so long and so hard, to close what for such a long period of time we have thought of and conceptualized as an achievement gap. Okay? So we've thought about this in terms of gaps in achievement. And what we're finding out and beginning to know more about is that perhaps we conceptualized it wrong when we put it in those terms. So what's interesting, there's an excellent article by Schmidt and Burrows. It was published in 2015 called Puzzling Out PISA. And what we find is that the PISA studies look at a lot more than just the achievement on the assessment. They go through numerous other variables to try to make some determinations about what could it be around the educational systems, the educational practices within the highest performing countries that seems to set them apart from the others. And one of the things that the researchers were interested in is what they defined as opportunities to learn. And so the way that they defined these opportunities to learn for mathematics was they defined it as the opportunities that kids had to engage in rigorous formal mathematics. So that is mathematics that is aligned to some grade level standard. Okay, so rigorous formal mathematics. The second is applied mathematics, mathematics that occur in some sort of real world settings. And then finally, the opportunity to engage in some sort of contextualized word problems, that they're not just engaged in naked arithmetic or computation. So they were able to measure the frequency of opportunities to learn. And lo and behold, what they found was very high correlations between achievement and opportunities to learn. Very high they found positive correlations for this. So what does that mean? It means that our high achieving students are those students who have had the most frequent opportunities to learn, and our low achieving students are the students that have had the least frequent opportunities to learn. So they took this correlation, and you can see the graph that's on the right of this slide shows the OECD average. So what was the average of the countries that participated in the PISA studies? What was the average correlation? And so you can see that the percentage of the average correlation, OECD average is right there at 1, because that is the average. And you can see that we in the United States had one of the highest correlations between high achieving students, or the achievement level of students, and opportunities to learn. So in the United States, we are above the average for the average correlation for that. So what that means is our high achieving students are having more frequent opportunities to learn. Our low achieving students are having less frequent opportunities to learn in comparison to the other OECD countries. This is critically important. Think about that for a moment. We have students who we know are low achieving, who we know we want to accelerate their progress and close this gap that exists. However, we're providing them with less opportunities to learn. Okay? So students who we are trying to accelerate their learning, trying to close a gap, yet we're providing them less opportunities to learn. So the hypothesis is that what we do, that once we use assessment and make some determinations about our high achieving students and our low achieving students with all good intents, we change the way instruction looks. However, the way that we're doing it by providing less opportunity for our low achieving students is actually exacerbating that gap instead of making it smaller. Okay, so this, when we talk about responsible assessment, that is a critical piece of understanding that is necessary for us to have. Before we engage in the use of assessment, we have to know that we are using the assessment to make the right decisions. Because what we know is that this is not an achievement gap, that there seems to be an opportunity gap between our low achieving and our high achieving students. So what does this mean? So that was some quantitative data that describes kids and their opportunities to learn based on where they're achieving in mathematics. But what does this look like on a day-to-day basis? Well, we know that it seems that low achieving students and high achieving students are actually learning a different mathematics, that we're teaching them. They're learning mathematics because we're teaching them a different mathematics. So when you tend to look at the way that kids approach arithmetic, low achieving students approach it in a remarkably different way. This study was done with third grade students. This is addition problems between 10 and 20. Is the data this is taken from? And so when we look at the way kids approach solving these types of problems, what we see is that they could take several different approaches, from inefficient to much more efficient and flexible. So the first of which could be counting all, an extremely inefficient approach, that if I had 10 plus 12, I start at 0, count up to 10, and then count on 12 more, all doing so by ones. Extremely inefficient. So that's one way. A next approach, and I would also just argue that that's not actually engaging in arithmetic. That's a counting exercise. And the next is really just a more flexible counting exercise, which is counting on, most of the time, the majority of students are counting on from a larger add-in in this type of situation. So going back to the problem that I started with, starting at 12 and then counting on 10 more. Okay. Some students may just simply know the facts. They can simply see them and recall them immediately. And then there's also this idea of derived facts. So, for example, the problem 19 plus 17 may seem like somewhat of a challenging problem to tackle. I'm going to have to add my 9 and my 7, and I'm going to have to compose a unit. But what kids might be able to do is say, well, I can just take 1 from the 17, make that 20, and then add the 16. So being flexible with what they know about the number sense, about the number system, is how kids use derived facts. So all of this is to say that when we look at how students approach these problems, our low achieving students, they seem to be counting all 22% of the time. They're counting on 72% of the time, and they use known facts 6% of the time. What's astounding here is that they have no flexibility with the number system. That they are not able to take advantage of their knowledge of the way the base 10 number system works. Whereas our high achieving students, that's where they're predominantly living when they're solving these problems. 61% of the time, they are using derived facts because of their deep knowledge of the number system. So that leads to the question: is that something that is different and inherent to these kids? And my argument would be no. It's that these students have learned a different mathematics and have been taught a different mathematics. And we'll show in a moment that the data seem to support that. Okay, so the first thing that we have learned is that what we have thought to be perhaps an achievement gap actually seems like it could be an opportunity gap, and that the way that we are using assessment data to differentiate the way that we provide instruction to kids, we have to be really careful about that, ensuring that we're providing equitable opportunities for all kids. So the second thing, the second point that we want to make about what's important about the way we use these assessments is what's known as the Matthew effects of mathematics. Matthew, the term Matthew effect coming from the book of the Bible, stating it has a verse around the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. This is a very well-documented phenomenon in reading, that poor readers who have very early maybe phonological problems, word-level decoding problems, they don't get into text. They don't read fluently, and as a result of that, because they are not reading as frequently and not reading as rich of text, their vocabulary does not develop at the same rate, and subsequently their comprehension, there's a gap in their comprehension as well. So what happens over time is our really strong readers, they are engaged in text. They're reading fluently. They're seeing more words. They're seeing more about vocabulary. They're having more opportunities to infer meaning to what they're reading and comprehend. And so the good readers get stronger, and our poor readers become poor readers. Well, we see the same thing seems to happen in mathematics as well. Our students who do not become proficient with these early numeracy concepts, these concepts that we know are supportive of computation and arithmetic, and then later on more complex mathematics, that as they struggle with that and they don't achieve mastery with those skills, that those tend to build upon themselves as well. So what we know is that there seems to be something in kindergarten that it's a critically important time to intervene or to prevent these types of problems. So we see this long 5-year growth trajectories, longitudinal research done by Paul Morgan and his colleagues that look at students who come to school with math difficulties. And we see that students who enter and then subsequently leave kindergarten below the 10th percentile, well, 70% of them will remain below the 10th percentile at the end of 5th grade. However, you can see that we can cut that statistic almost in half to 36% if we can bump them out of that 10th percentile by the end of kindergarten. So if we can get them above the 10th percentile, only 36% of them will be below the 10th percentile in 5th grade. So it's important. This is important for us because what we need to know is who are those students who are at risk early on? Who are those kids with the math difficulties? Okay, so now we know two things. One is that we need to increase opportunities for all kids. The second thing that we know is that we need to identify kids early on and prevent issues from becoming bigger and larger. Okay, so we need to be identifying the right kids and be thinking really carefully about the opportunities that we're providing them with. Okay, and so the next thing that I want to move into is we think about growth in mathematics and what is predictive of growth. And so this really great study was done in 2013 where the researchers looked at a lot of different variables. They had two really large data sets that examined students' growth. It's important to note that growth in mathematics from 5th grade to 10th grade. And they tried to really think about all of the variables that could be most predictive of that growth. And then they put those into different models to see which ones were indeed the most predictive. And so the variables that, some of the variables that they defined One was intelligence, as measured by a standardized cognitive assessment or IQ test. Um, Something else could potentially be extrinsic motivation, for example, in the forms of good grades and praise from parents and teachers. The third was deep learning strategies. So those kids who say things like, when I solve mathematics problems, I think about other similar problems that I've solved, and I think about connecting this problem and this mathematics to other problems and other mathematics that I know. And then fourth is this idea of perceived control, which is this thought that if I put forth effort and I work hard towards something, then I have the control to get the results that I would like. So I just want to give a moment for you to contemplate that question and think about what did these researchers find as the most predictive of growth in mathematics from 5th to 10th grade. All right, so what they found was that it was not intelligence, it was not extrinsic motivation, and that the most predictive was perceived control. So it was from 5th to 10th grade, these kids who thought, if I put forth the effort and I work hard, then I will receive the results that I want. Those were the kids who made the most growth. Deep learning strategies did have some additional, added some predictive value above that as well, but perceived control was the highest and most predictive. So what does that mean? What does that mean? It means that these, what we've kind of viewed as non-academic, non-cognitive factors seem to matter. And perhaps they seem to matter more than the things that we think are traditionally thought as most important. And it's really almost the polar opposite of how we have culturally thought about mathematics in this country for so long. So many of us tend to think about mathematics and our interaction with it as purely a binary, that I am inherently good at mathematics or I am inherently bad at mathematics. And I think that you've probably heard that before, heard people say that, or perhaps even said it yourself. But what we find is that is not the case. That intelligence is not predictive of that growth at all, and that it's fostering this idea that kids have control of their own outcomes, and it's based on the work and effort that they put into it. It is the critical part. So what we've learned up to this point, then, to summarize, is that we have to think really carefully about opportunities that kids have. We need to prevent problems early, and we need to be poised and ready to tackle those problems as early as we can by identifying the right kids and providing the right opportunities. And third is that we not only need to think about the academic concepts and skills that we're developing in these kids, but also the more of the affective domain and the domain that impacts the way kids think about what drives their behaviors and how they're intrinsically motivated to engage with mathematics. Okay, so those are three really critical and important things. So I promise if we work hard to do these four things, that we will see growth in our kids that exceeds what we're doing right now. So if we are able to identify the right kids, if we're able to intervene, and when I say intervene, I also want to ensure that we think about the word prevent issues early on. So we identify who those kids are, we intervene early to prevent issues, and we do so by increasing opportunity. Okay, we increase the opportunity for them to learn. They're engaged in rigorous mathematics. And we increase their perceived control, so we know that dispositions towards mathematics matters. If we do those four things, that we will see growth in mathematics in our students. So that's what we know. Despite that, what we're doing is that we're identifying kids. Sometimes we're identifying kids, the right kids, sometimes we're not. I think that evidence is really clear. And then as we are identifying those kids, for those kids who are deemed low achieving, they receive less rigorous instruction, which is more frequently focused on rote skills and procedures only. So we're not doing those things right now. And I would argue that assessment is often the linchpin to this problem, okay? That we're using assessment data to sort and classify kids with great intent, with the intent of closing what we deem is an achievement gap, okay? But we're approaching it in the wrong way, because what we're often doing is that we're using assessment to constrain opportunity, okay, rather than enhance opportunity. So what we are saying and arguing when we're talking about responsible assessment and how these measures need to be used in a classroom is that how are we using these assessments? These assessments have been validated to identify the right kids, okay? So if we use them in the right way, we can identify the right kids. We can jump on the right kind of instruction early and provide these rich opportunities early, okay, as soon as we can. And that we also need to be thinking about increasing these kids' perceived control, which is going to be a culture shift for our classrooms, a culture shift for how we think and talk about mathematics. Now, mathematics is hard. It is difficult. But if we work hard and we work together and we struggle and we make mistakes and we overcome those mistakes, then we all can all grow in our understanding of mathematics. Okay. So how do we use assessment to do these things?